So the Cold War is going to have a big impact on the American home front as well. And we're going to see this idea of domestic containment. And so not only did we have to protect against the spread of communism around the globe, but we also had to protect against the idea that communism could seep into the United States. And so this fear of communism, known as the Red Scare, is going to continue in the decades of the Cold War as well. And so this Red Scare, this domestic containment, it manifested itself in various ways. One way it manifested itself was in kind of a reduction of women's rights and freedoms. Going into World War II and during World War II, women had played a vital role taking jobs in factories while men were all fighting and becoming heads of households. Well, this domestic containment kind of thought that the best role for women was to take care of the home and to raise good patriotic children. And that was our best defense against communism seeping into the United States. So in some ways, women's roles actually take a step backwards in the decades immediately after World War II. It's also going to manifest itself in things like McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy was this obscure senator from Wisconsin who came up with this list that he said were communists who had already infiltrated the US government. And no one on that list was ever found to have actual ties to communism, but it set off this communist witch hunt where people feared that communists could be anywhere. And people, especially Hollywood, people were blacklisted, where if you were found to have ties to communism or thought to have ties to communism, your career was pretty much over. We're also going to see in the United States, it would take a couple of decades, really not until the mid 60s, but we're going to see the rise of this new feminism. And the spark that really ignited this new women's movement in the United States was a book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. And what The Feminine Mystique talked about was how women weren't happy just being housewives and mothers, that they wanted more. And so it became almost an instant bestseller and gave rise to this whole new women's movement that would start in the mid 60s and continue through the 70s and in a lot of ways continues all the way to present day. We're also going to see the US civil rights movement emerge in the decades after World War II. And really the spark that set off the civil rights movement was Rosa Parks. After Rosa Parks famously refuses to give up her seat to a white patron on the buses, she would be arrested, but that would set off the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's during the Montgomery bus boycott that Martin Luther King Jr. begins to emerge as a leader of civil rights. And Martin Luther King Jr. Was inspired by Gandhi's nonviolent methods and used it to help lead the civil rights movement here in the United States. And the civil rights movement fought against segregation in the South, which they were successful in doing so with the passing of things like Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools. They also fought against unfair discrimination and segregation in public places as well. And ultimately, they would get an end to discrimination with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so African Americans made many gains starting in the mid 1950s and through the 1960s. We're also going to see a huge increase in consumerism. The US economy was doing very well, not just in the decade after the World War II, but really all the way from World War II until 1970. And so you had basically 2 decades where the economy was doing really well, and that's going to lead to a huge increase in consumerism. And people in the United States and Western Europe, for that matter, had access to all these new consumer goods. And so you could buy all kinds of new household appliances and automobiles, and we're going to see a huge growth in the suburbs and people buying houses as well because of this economic boom. Another big part of the Cold War was the space race. So the space race started in 1957 when the Soviets launched the first satellite into space called the Sputnik 1. And this kind of sets off these fears in the United States that they had fallen behind the Soviets. And so the United States responds by creating NASA and pumping tons of money into our space program. They also are going to increase the rigor of our education system and put more emphasis on things like math and science and technology in our education system because we didn't want to fall behind the Soviets. And so the launching of the Sputnik sets off this space race to see who could accomplish the next great feats in space over the next decade or so. And honestly, the Soviet Union won most of those races. They would be the first to send a man into orbit. But the United States would claim victory over the space race when they put a man on the moon in 1969. And following that, we begin to see more cooperation in our space program between the United States and the Soviet Union. We also, in general, after Stalin's death in 1953, we start to see a little bit better relationship with the Soviet Union. Not that it was great, but we do see some periods where the tensions begin to thaw a little bit. And part of that was because Nikita Khrushchev kind of relaxed some of the harsher policies of Stalin. In fact, Khrushchev even visits the United States in 1959. And in doing so, he came across very well. He was a likable guy, and people got to kind of see him in person and kind of put a human face on communism.